I'm Chris Shepherd. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, a little bit about the global wildlife trade, and then I'm going to jump into one of the main areas of work that we do. I've set up the Monitor, we'll just call it Monitor. I set up Monitor 5 years ago. We're a very small organization. There's only 5 of us and a handful of consultants working on projects. Prior to that, I worked for a bigger organization. I was the director of the Southeast Asia office for an organization called Traffic, where I worked for over 20 years there. Maybe we'll just go with. So I'll tell you a little bit about wildlife trade. Global wildlife trade is comparable in size to the drug trade, to the arms trade, and to human trade. It's massive. We don't always hear about it, and what we do hear is usually bits and pieces on Nat Geo or something about tigers or elephants or things like that. But it's absolutely massive, and it's one of the leading threats to a lot of species and a growing list of species. And we've lost a lot of species already due to the wildlife trade. In the past, I worked on elephants. I did a lot of work on ivory trade. I did a lot of undercover work on ivory trade in India, setting up sting operations there, and ivory trade on the Thai-Myanmar border and all over the place. I did a lot on tigers, some rhino horn work, all kinds of stuff. And then I decided, well, I'll set up Monitor and focus on the species that no one else focuses on, which I think is a good idea. It's not easy to raise funds for species that most people haven't heard of, but I don't work on. We have a little project right now on lions where we're looking at lions being smuggled out of South Africa into Laos and Vietnam, just the bones, and looking at that. But apart from that, we're not really working on any of the big charismatic megafauna anymore. One of the biggest obstacles I've come up against in my entire career is a lack of published evidence. In order to change laws, in order to catalyze enforcement action, in order to reduce demand, in order to change international policy, you need to have work published. So that's what we do. We do a lot of research, we do some investigative work, and we publish and publish and publish. We've also done a lot of capacity building for enforcement agencies. I've trained about 5,000 enforcement staff over the years, mostly customs and police, and some military and wildlife department people. So we do capacity building, we work on reducing demand, we do all kinds of things, but it all boils down to providing evidence to remove these obstacles. There's lots of text, don't worry about it. We're trying to get rid of the illegal and unsustainable trade. We're trying to reduce that. We're trying to reduce the impact of that through publishing our work, raising awareness, better use of legal deterrents, and that sort of thing. And we do have a niche. There's very few organizations working on the species we work on. So it can be very depressing. I've been to bear farms where you go into the bear farms and watch them draining the bile out of the bears. I've been to camps where they're breaking in wild-caught elephant calves and that sort of thing. It can be very depressing, but it's also very, very interesting and very challenging. I've never in my entire career had a day where I didn't learn something new. The learning curve is like this forever, and I really like that. So we do a lot of investigations and research. We also do a lot of policy work. COVID kind of put us in that place in a big way. We did less field work, less market surveys and that sort of thing, and a lot more work on policies and demand reduction and different interventions like that. Also, before I go any further, if you have any questions as I go along, just stop me and ask. We don't have to wait till the end. If there's something you want to talk about while I'm going along, please do. This is nice. I give talks often to hundreds of people at a time. This is great. We can just stop and talk as we go. Next picture. So one of the areas we work on that we have a big focus on is the bird trade, and we're doing a little bit on parrots, a little bit on hornbills, but the bulk of our bird work is on songbirds, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Again, lots of text, don't worry about that. Go back, Ricky. So in many parts of the world, keeping songbirds is a traditional pastime. It's a hobby. It's a means of income, etc., etc. But it's led to a lot of declines and extinctions of a number of birds. Even in the times I've been working on songbirds, I used to count species in markets that I no longer see. They're gone. Some of the species I'm working on now that we're really concerned about, if you would have asked me 10 or 15 years ago if I'd be worried about those, I would have laughed. Not a chance. There's bazillions of them. And now there are top priority species. So it's happening really quick. I've listed some here, but I'll show you the pictures of them later. Some of our trade is focused on in-country trade, but a big focus that we have is looking at the international trade. So I'll talk a bit about both of those, but we'll focus mostly on the international trade. So we'll start at the beginning. Where they're captured is usually very basic. Here we've got birds that have been caught and just rolled up in leaves, and sticks are put through the leaves to hold the birds in place. Birds are caught mainly in two ways. One is they'll take a really good singing bird, put it out in the forest, chained up, and then put glue all over the branches around, and when it sings, or mist nets, and when it sings, it attracts rivals that also have good songs, which are the ones you want, and they get stuck and then they get taken away. So it's all very basic at this end. Here people just sewing them into just between material to keep them in place while they transfer them to the markets. A lot of people look at the livelihood aspects of wildlife trade. I've never met anyone who makes their entire living out of trapping birds. It's usually a side income. So somebody might work in forestry or farming or another rural activity, or just go out on weekends and do it. It's a side income more than a livelihood issue. Transit, this is where the middlemen get involved and the volumes start going up. These pictures are from Indonesia, where the biggest bird trade is, and they ship birds just like this in boxes, and usually they're smuggled in the back of vans or just on public buses when they're still at a domestic or a national level.
What's the survival rate of birds being transported? Is it quite
It's not good. Yeah, I did a study on 3 species of munias, little small birds in Indonesia once, and from the point of capture to the point of market within the first 24 hours, it was 50% mortality rate. And that's pre-sale, so yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
So once you, that's what the bottoms of the cages look like. A lot of them, so we survey markets, we go into markets and count birds. In fact, Loretta and I one time, where did we go, Medan? Yeah, you just see mountains of dead birds everywhere. On weekends, in Bangkok, they have a weekend market, and if you go to the bins there, on Monday morning, they're heaped with animals. So the mortality rate's huge, but they're cheap. It doesn't. Some of them are more expensive than others, but a lot of them are opportunistically caught. We call them cut flowers, the cheap ones. They look nice. They don't cost very much, and they don't last long. But whatever, it didn't cost a lot. It was pretty. It was nice, but it was a cut flower. So then they go to the markets. Some of the markets are huge. There's one in Jakarta that when we do surveys of that, 6 of us go in. It takes us 3 days for all 6 of us to count the birds, and on average we get between 19 and 20,000 birds that go in there on a 3-day count or a 2-day count if we're doing well. So we count every species, every bird. We get price data on the ones we're interested in. We're interested in trends. What's fashionable right now? What is there a lot of? What's disappearing and why? Where are they going? Is it for local demand? Is it for a foreign market? Is it international trade? So we look at all kinds of stuff in the markets, but counting birds in the markets is very difficult. Anyone know why it might be so difficult to count birds?
Because they die fast?
Well, they die fast, they move around a lot. Another way is when we go and count, when I go to market surveys in places that just sell dead animals, like there's a market in Myanmar I go and count, and there I count pangolins and elephant tusks and rhino horns and bear paws and all that. None of those make noise, so I can carry a recorder in my pocket. And as I walk along, I can say 5 clouded leopard skins, 2 tiger skins, 3 elephant tusks, and I count out. Bird markets are so noisy because there's 20,000 birds in there. You can't hear yourself think. So you have to just remember things, and every 6 or 7 shops, we memorize the order birds appear in a field guide. And then when we go to a shop, we just count how many fit into that order, and then we go out after 6 or 7 shops, go sit down and have one of many, many glasses of tea, or go to the washroom and just write down what you've remembered from those 6 or 7 shops, and then head off and do the next load. So it takes a long time. Next, please. This is another one. This is typical market. This particular market is 3 floors tall, and it's like this. It's just full, absolutely full. So this is one of the reasons birds are purchased. This is a singing competition. This particular pitch is from Singapore. A lot of birds are traded for their song. So birds are traded largely for 3 main reasons. 1, their color, they're pretty. 2, their song. This is the biggest driver, is the song. And these are the most expensive birds, the singing birds, for these big, giant singing competitions that have huge prizes. And they're not just in Asia. Florida has a lot of these singing competitions. New Jersey has a big one. So you have people that are professional songbird song judges, and these are a really big deal. And the third reason people collect birds is in my mind the sickest reason is people want to have things that are getting rare. So perceived rarity is a driver. As a species gets closer to extinction, the price goes up, and so does demand. So once it becomes rare, the speed in which it's approaching extinction accelerates.
Is there a fairly high mortality rate with them being out in the open like that?
Can you go back?
As opposed to normally being in a forest area?
So the birds that they have in here they usually train them a lot. So they're all wild caught, but they've been in captivity long enough, because a wild caught bird doesn't sing right away. So they keep them in captivity till they adjust to food. Most songbird competition birds are also seed eaters, so they're a little easier to care for. And so the mortality rate in these ones isn't as much. And these birds here, that right there might be a $5,000 bird. So they put it out, do their thing, and then the covers go on it, and it gets put away and everything. You think about a country that has a monthly salary of $200, and that's a $5,000 songbird. So they do take care of them.
I'm just looking at it in terms of normally those would be hidden trees, foliage, and now they're out in the open.
Yeah, so they do have covers when they're not being judged, like you can see a cover on this one. But yeah, the mortality rates, and plus inappropriate food for a lot of birds. I've seen big cages of kingfishers for sale, and they've got rice in the bowls, or meat, just chicken meat in there and stuff that they're not going to eat. So they die for all kinds of reasons.
Chris, do you know the country that's the biggest purchaser of the illegal trade?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Indonesia is the biggest source and the biggest consumer. It consumes its own birds to the point that the countries around Indonesia are being vacuumed out of the best songbirds. So Malaysia is next door to Indonesia, and some of the best songbirds, best singers are gone from Malaysia because of the demand in Indonesia. But it really depends on the species. As soon as a bird becomes very rare, the same birds that used to be sold here might be going to the Netherlands or Germany or the US. South America is a big exporter of birds, but we've just started scratching the surface on that. We really don't know where all those are going. But Indonesia, in all the work we've done, Indonesia is by far the biggest consumer.
When you're in the market counting birds, I assume you have to do this sort of surreptitiously?
Yeah, to a certain extent. And it depends on the country. If the country's had a lot of enforcement, then it becomes more difficult, and the markets are less obvious and less open. If, like Indonesia, where the markets, everybody's untouchables there, 100% of the bird trade in those markets in Indonesia is illegal. But weak enforcement, corruption, et cetera, enable the trade. So we don't have to really be careful because they're not going to get in trouble anyways. If it's a country where there's a lot of enforcement, then we different tactics, less frequent surveys or things like that. Plus, a lot of the trade now has moved online. So we could go online right now and buy a clouded leopard. We could buy a sun bear. We could buy a gibbon. We could name an animal, and we could find it online for sale. It's very difficult to tackle because where are they? It's basically down to sting operations, which are expensive and difficult for the authorities to do. Some countries don't even have laws that prohibit online trade yet. So a lot of the dealing, every day you could find tens of thousands of birds for sale online, especially parrots. Songbirds not as much because the buyers want to hear the song. So in Indonesia, there's big clubs. We don't have the music that goes with this, but it's really heavy metal electric guitar that goes with this. Indonesia, kicamania means like songbird craze, songbird. And there's all these clubs everywhere. This one's called Birdhood. There's all these different clubs and groups set up for everything. There's otter collector clubs, there's squirrel collector clubs, there's primate collector clubs, everything. But the bird collector groups are the biggest. And they have regular meetings, they have online forums, buy and sell online, go to the meetings, everything. There's clubs for all kinds of illegal wildlife. We've done a lot of work on otters, on the trade of otters for pets. And in Japan, they have otter cafes where you go in and sit down and have a coffee, and there's otters around in cages and stuff. Or there's animal cafes that will have a lot of different ones. And Japan's currently, hopefully, going to finish off or clean up that with new legislation coming in. I was in an animal cafe in Bangkok one time, and there was armadillo, there was otters, there was rheas, cassowaries, baby cassowaries, bush babies from Africa. You name it, you can find it in these things. So these clubs and these cafes and stuff are a big thing.
So what do these clubs actually do? Do they buy the birds?
They buy and sell birds. They show their birds. They brag. It's like that. You have a even rarer bird, and once everybody's got the same kind of bird, then nobody wants that one anymore, and they go and they want to find something even more rare, something that nobody else has. So this is where, I've found toucans for sale in Indonesia. Cassowary chicks for sale. And does everyone know what a cassowary is? Okay, so cassowary it's second biggest bird in the world after an ostrich. There's 3 species of cassowary. There's 3 species of cassowary. Southern cassowaries get about this tall. They have 3 toes, but this one is basically a knife. It's just a big claw, and that's what they disembowel you with. But when they're this big, when they're newly hatched, they're amazing. They look like little dinosaurs. They've got a big bony ridge on their head that stands about this tall. So they look really prehistoric, very amazing. But when they're an adult, they'll rip through a chain link fence. So not very clever, but people like that stuff. So those clubs, they'll have those and brag about them. Big owl clubs. Harry Potter, once that movie came out, everybody wanted owls. And so there's owl clubs and owl cafes and all that.
So is there a lot of money in those clubs? Like, is it?
Yeah, some of them are. It depends on the species. So a high quality songbird of certain species can be thousands and thousands. Some of the clubs that have like tortoises and stuff. I saw a tortoise from Madagascar once in Jakarta. It was selling for 45,000 US for a pet. So there's a lot of money in them once they become rare. So this is a seizure. Typically, the birds are being transported like this. The authorities catch them. The seizure's happening every day, but they're just getting the mules. They're getting the drivers of the buses or the drivers of the cars, and they're not going after the right people to put the whole business out of business. They're largely picking off the drivers. Women get paid to carry a suitcase on a plane. They don't even know what's in it. They go to jail for 5 years. Inside was like $300,000 worth of tortoises or something. Those are the kind of people that get caught. The people organizing and orchestrating all of that are rarely caught. So it's usually just a roadblock and a car gets pulled over with a lot of birds in boxes.
What happens to the birds after they seize them?
Yeah.
Can they be
It depends on the country and it depends on the species. So some countries have a policy where every live animal seized is euthanized. Some countries euthanize a lot, but if the species are of high conservation value or really rare species, those will enter into a zoo or a breeding program. I was part of a seizure one time where they seized 5 tons of live cobra. What do? Nobody wants them back. Nobody wants to pay for them to be repatriated. Nobody's really sure where they all come from. So it's a big mess. In Indonesia, they often release the birds, but they're releasing birds where the seizure took place. Those birds could be from anywhere. And one of the biggest obvious problems now with these, that is becoming more and more of an issue because of COVID, is when you get all these animals from all over the place brought to one market. So you bring in live animals from everywhere. In the market, they might sell. I've seen cages where there's fruit bats on the top, then songbirds, then maybe some monkeys, and on the bottom are chickens, and people are eating those chickens. The animals are coming in from all over the world in huge numbers. Their stress levels are very high. And when their stress levels are high, they're more vulnerable to disease. Their immune systems are weak. So it's a huge disease swap. I am amazed it took so long for something like COVID to actually happen, because these markets are disgusting. You go to markets where they slaughter deer on the sidewalk in the same place every day for years, and there's no refrigeration. And it's just a mess. So releasing animals is not always a good idea, because you're releasing potentially disease all over the place. You're releasing species where they're not native to, all kinds of problems. But it's such an ugly part of the whole business, because really what do you do? A zoo might want a cobra, but they're not going to want 5 tons. A zoo might want a couple of songbirds for part of their collection or part of a breeding program they have, but if these seizures that happen, the organization that did this seizure in Indonesia, this is it's Health and Quarantine, the seizures average between 5,000 and 10,000 birds every seizure. What do you do with them? But some countries just euthanize. Some countries, depends on the corruption levels, depending on the laws, they just sell the animals back to the dealers out the back door, and away they go again. So, yeah, okay. So what are we trying to do about it? It sounds like a pretty depressing thing. I sometimes feel like I'm talking myself out of a job and want to go do something else, but there is a lot of good stuff happening. We are doing a lot of research to expose the illegal trade in species that no one's even heard of. We're pushing really hard to get species that are disappearing adequately protected by law. International laws, we work a lot on. There's an international law called CITES. That's a whole 3-day course. I won't start that right now. But it pretty much every country in the world is a part of that, and species get listed when you can justify that international trade is a threat. Nobody's looked at songbird trade, so out of the 6,000 plus songbird species or passerine species in the world, only about 40 of them are listed in CITES. So we're working really hard to get CITES as a more effective tool for songbirds. We assist enforcement agencies a lot. I did a lot more of this when we were living in Malaysia, but we collect information on how the trade works, how the trade networks are mapped out, who's involved, where enforcement agencies might have the best chance of success and having an impact. And at the same time, we're looking at, well, these enforcement agencies maybe can't even do their job properly because they know nothing about wildlife trade. So we do capacity building. We engage the authorities. What kind of species should they be looking out for? What laws should they be using? What airlines they should be watching? Which airports are priority? And that's really very interesting work. It's very frustrating because it's always the little people that get caught, not the big people, but not always. Once in a while the right people get caught. But it's a very interesting aspect of the work. One of my staff is a criminologist. She looks at how to better use legal deterrence beyond just putting people in jail to reduce demand in a bigger way. It's very interesting stuff. Policies, yeah, we look at legislation. We look at Canada's legislation recently. We look at legislation all over the place. Look for weaknesses, strengths, best practices, gaps. Where should things be improved? How can we improve it? We've done a lot of work on that with bears, for example.
What would be some examples of how you would work to reduce demand?
Yeah, good, very good question. It's a whole science in its own. There's different levels. There's just raising awareness, and some people won't buy species because they didn't know it was illegal before, they do now. That's very simple. There's a lot more to it. We worked on a project for a number of years reducing rhino horn demand in Vietnam. Rhino horn traditionally was used for traditional medicines, but in Vietnam it's now more of a status thing. Rich guys with their big parties, they use rhino horn they take rhino horn to show how rich they are. They use it for treating their hangovers. Doesn't work, but that's how wealthy you are. You use rhino horn to treat your hangovers. So the way we're tackling that is trying to make that socially unacceptable within that level of society. So our partners on that were Mercedes-Benz, golf and country clubs, the Communist Party of Vietnam, and the Business Association of Vietnam. And the idea was to, and it's still ongoing, to make it socially unacceptable in your circle to use rhino horn. It's still an experiment. It's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, some people think, well, the best thing to do is just catch these guys and throw them in jail. And for some of these guys, I couldn't agree more. But to impact, to affect a change big enough that everyone that buys songbirds is no longer going to do it is a huge task. Enforcement and legislation is part of it. Social acceptance is part of it. General awareness. There's different ways to use legislation as well, and even just enforcement is very complex because some people aren't scared of being caught because they know they're not going to get caught. Yeah.
How do you deal with a situation where it's the cultural norm, like the songbird competitions in Singapore?
Yeah.
Laws aren't going to have any effect on that.
No, you're right. So
aspect of bird trade.
Singapore is an interesting one because Singapore is so small and is a very high level of education and is very well behaved. In Singapore, you don't chew gum. Okay, well, we don't chew gum. Nobody chews gum. Things seem to work in Singapore a little better. So law is one thing, but Singapore is one of the places where awareness work has really worked. There was an ad with who was it? Jackie Chan. There was an ad with Jackie Chan when the buying stops, the killing will too, and they had a few other celebrities, and people listened. I don't want to be part of causing these species to go extinct. Singapore is an exception though. In places like Indonesia, awareness raising, WWF made posters at one point, I think it was WWF, made posters of the protected birds in Indonesia. You go in the bird market, that's on the wall with prices beside each one. So that didn't work. So there has to be different ways. There's a move in Indonesia using religious leaders who talk about wildlife trade in the mosques, and that seems to be quite effective in some places. So there has to be different approaches depending on the culture, depending on the species involved, and depending on the purpose. If it's something that you believe, if you don't use this part of the animal, you will have cancer, it's very hard to change because nobody wants to die. But if it's something simple like you want a plowshare tortoise from Madagascar only because it's cool, but you could go to jail for 10 years, that might have a different impact than as if that tortoise was going to save your life or was perceived to save your life. It's very complex. And culture in Indonesia, for the Javanese culture to be a man, to be a real man, you need a house, you need a wife, not necessarily in this order. You need a knife called a crease. You need a songbird. There's one more that I can't remember. But so it's that embedded in culture that you're not even actually a real man if you don't have a songbird. So changing those perceptions is hard. But there's a lot of when I first started working in Indonesia, there wasn't very many NGOs, non-government organizations like ourselves. There was very few, and very few grassroots organizations, and now there's tons of them. So that's very, very positive. There's a lot of Indonesians tackling the Indonesian wildlife trade rather than it just being foreigners, which is very nice, and I think a huge step in the right direction. So we catalyze action. This is kind of what I've been talking about. We publish reports in those papers, and those papers might be used by other conservation organizations to decide, well, actually we've only been focusing on tigers, but really we should be focusing on turtles in the same landscape, or we should be focusing on songbirds in the same landscape. So a lot of our work gets picked up by other NGOs, and we partner with a lot of other NGOs, and that happens. We work really hard to get legislation at international levels changed. I've said that many, many times. The IUCN Red List, that's a thing where every species in the world is assessed. Every single species is assessed on its, whether it's extinct, near extinct, critically endangered, endangered, threatened, and it's categorized. We inform that, and that is used by a lot of governments when they put together their protected species list. We impact harvest quotas. So if a country has a quota of, let's say they have 100,000 of a particular bird is allowed to be removed from the wild, and then based on our research, they might cut it down to 25,000 or something. So our work is used in a lot of different ways like that, and we publish it. This is a straw-headed bulbul. I'll come back to that in a minute. I seem to have got that one out of order. Next, please. So this is the kind of thing we publish. This little guy was only really discovered, it was thought to be a different bird until the early 2000s or late 1997, I think. Then they decided, wait, it's actually a completely different species, so they split them. And I've done a lot of work on this species, trying to get it protected. And as of 2018, it became protected in Indonesia, where it's endemic. And now we're pushing hard to get it protected at an international level, because as it's becoming more and more rare, we now see them showing up in the Netherlands in bird shows, in Germany in bird shows, and there's no laws preventing that at this point. But it's only found on one little island, only lives in mountains, does not live in areas that have been logged. So we need to get on that and do a lot more. So we publish things in journals and make as much noise about these things as we can. It's called the Sumatran laughing thrush. Next, please. We look at emerging issues. These are crested jays. 10 years ago, I never saw more than one crested jay in a survey ever. Now they're popular, partly because they look weird, people like that. But they have an interesting call, so that's a little bit of the issue. And then 2016, we saw a couple of butcher birds from Papua New Guinea for sale. Now there's butcher bird clubs all over the place, and they're being taken out of the wild by the Brazilians as well. They're not protected at all. So we have projects going on both the crested jay and the butcher, all the different butcher bird species, trying to catch up. Okay, we need to get them protected, or at least get quotas in place. We need to start looking at the international trade and see where they're going to show up first, and make sure that we're trying to get ahead of the game there, and try to have them protected in the consumer countries before it gets ugly. But we're usually a little bit behind the ball. People think we should be raising awareness amongst dealers and traders. They're way ahead of the game. They know everything. We learn so much from them, because they know what the next trend is going to be. They know what's in fashion. They know everything. Which species is disappearing. I was at a reptile dealer's house once, and he had a box with 6 reptiles in it, and he showed me every one. I didn't know what any of them were. He said, "Of course you don't. No one does. They're all new species, completely undescribed species." So they're way ahead of things. I don't bother reading all this, but here's something we're really concerned about, is we're starting to see North American birds showing up in trade, especially in Europe. Bluebirds is one. We're seeing a big trend in increase in bluebirds. Mountain bluebirds not as much, but mostly eastern and western. Blue jays and Steller's jays are becoming popular. In fact, all the jays. There's a number of jays further south than here. Haven't seen gray jays yet, but Steller's, blue jays, pinion jays, California, the scrub jays, all of those are starting to become popular, especially in Europe. So we're currently trying to put together funds, trying to find funds so we could do an investigation into that and expose that, because generally the North America and Europe have legislation you can use if you prove that there's an issue. If we just went and said this is a problem, no one's going to listen, we have to publish something and show them that it's an issue.
So this has to get through export market somehow, I mean.
Yeah.
that-
There's different ways of doing that. You can lie and say you've been breeding them in captivity forever, and they have to prove you haven't. But usually it's stuff them in a water bottle in your suitcase. So water bottles, take the cap off. I'm not teaching you how, I'm just telling you how to do it. Cut the bottom off a water bottle, stick a bird in it, put tape around the bottom so it can't slip back out, and then just take the cap off and they breathe out through there. But they also go in boxes. You might get a legal shipment of budgies, and if you look inside, they're all something else, those kind of things. So some of our species of high concern that we're doing a lot on, white-rumped shama and straw-headed bulbul are two that are big items right now, and are both going to receive global protection this year in a conference that takes place in Panama next month, the CITES convention. Every 2 years there's this massive conference where 6,000 people go sometimes, usually about 3,000 though, and they vote on which species proposals. People have put forward proposals to protect them, and they vote, and it's chaos. They're terrible meetings, but good things sometimes come out of them. These two should both get full protection globally this year. This is one of the most popular songbirds, the white-rumped shama. Actually, all four of these are four of the main ones that are used in those singing competitions. They're all seed eaters. This one is now extinct in Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, and almost all gone from Malaysia. Ironically, its last stronghold is Singapore, where it's doing quite well. There's about 40 pairs of them there. It's peanuts, but it's 40 pairs, and they're doing well. So hopefully and this one has the nicest song. Go home and Google straw-headed bulbul song and listen to it. It's the most beautiful song you've ever heard from a bird. These guys aren't bad either. And there's the laughing thrush I told you about, and Chinese huamai. We're doing a lot of Chinese huamai trade work, but in the US, where there's a big demand for it. So these are some of our species of concern. I'm the vice chair of the IUCN's specialist group on songbirds, and my job is to help prioritize which birds people should be looking at. That's part of that role. And these are some of our top birds. I'm also involved in the Aquarium and Zoo Association in the US, and I'm an advisor to their songbird working group. And again, I've been able to stuff these four in there as their top priorities as well, so it's good. So here's a bird that this guy's almost gone. It's from endemic to the island of Java in Indonesia. It's called the Javan green magpie. Its call's interesting, but not that great. But it's almost been wiped out because of the cage bird song. And this is called, let's see, I don't even know what the English word is for it. This bird is used as a trainer. So let's say you have, can you go back, Raven, one, please? So this guy here is white-rumped shama, very beautiful sound, da-da-da-da. You get into competition, they all have a beautiful sound. So you want to improve its call. So you keep it in a cage, next. You keep it in a cage beside this guy, and he's gonna pick up some of this guy's notes. This is called a masteran bird, which means like a trainer bird. So your white-rumped shama is now gonna include some green magpie notes in his song. You've got an edge at the competition. So a lot of birds are really heavily traded for masteran birds. This is one that's almost gone because of that, even though you'll never see one of these in an actual competition. This one's got bands on its legs because there's a rescue center in Indonesia that is now breeding a few of these species for eventual release back into the wild. Actually, they're just learning how to breed them. They've had their first successes a couple years ago. So woodpeckers are used as these trainer birds, all kinds of birds, and you just surround your songbird with all these other kinds of birds so that your songbird picks up the notes, and then when you hear these guys, you have no idea what kind of bird it is because it's imitating so many different calls in its song, and then you've got on the edge of the singing competitions. So this is a high priority species, the Chester Zoo in the UK and this one center in Indonesia, the only two places in the world that have them in captivity, and they finally managed to have a successful breeding and rearing by the parent birds. So there's a little bit of hope. They're pretty much extinct in the wild. There might be a dozen or so left, but the captive population now will hopefully climb a little bit, and we'll hang on to them. So some of the work we do, so we take all this kind of information, I won't go too much into this, but we look at what species are protected, whether they're internationally traded, what their conservation status is. We look at how climate change might be impacting them, feral species, habitat loss, palm oil, all these other things, and mash it all together, and then we look at that's how we prioritize what species should be our highest priorities. So it's not just which ones we see the most of in the market. Mountain birds are under a lot of competition now in Asia because the lowland birds are moving up the mountains because of climate change. So that's an additional threat. All these other things. Releasing confiscated birds in an area is a threat to species that are supposed to be there. So we look at all these different variables and come up with what we call our knowledge index, and that we use to help prioritize which species we should be looking at moving forward. This month, we're going to launch our global database. We've put all 6,000 plus passerines into one database just so we can start tracking which ones are in trade, are they heavily traded, what the trends in the trade are they, yeah, it's way too small to read, don't even try, I can't even read it from here. Are they captive bred? Is it easy to breed them in captivity? Is it very difficult? Are they extinct in the wild? All these different things. And then using this, we will be advising other organizations which species they should work on. We'll be choosing which species we should work on, and which ones need international protection, which ones need national protection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It looks very, very boring, but it's very useful. But it's, so since we've done this now, we're also setting one up for the pigeon and dove trade. There's 360 species of pigeon doves, which is much easier than 6,000 passerines. And we're doing one for the 60 species of hornbills in the world as well, which will be the third one that we do. So the things we want to do, we of course want to continue exposing the illegal trade and insisting of enforcement, but more and more we want to just focus on providing evidence and working towards reducing demand, and at the same time raising awareness. Very few people in the world know the songbird trade is an issue, and at the same time we're losing them. There's a bird called the Javan pied starling. We see loads of them in trade. Now we still see loads of them in trade, but it's 100% extinct in the wild. And now they're just being traded amongst a group of people that have some breeding going on, and they're collecting them, and they're crossbreeding with other species, which isn't very useful. But so we need to raise awareness that these things are happening, and it's a big deal. Why are birds important to us? What's going to happen when we lose them? And all of these things. Yeah.
Do you know, is there the songbirds that come here from South America, are any of those amongst the ones that are in the trade?
Yeah. So that's a big thing. There's a lot of birds coming out of Suriname is probably the biggest exporter of birds in South America, probably, and a lot of our birds migrate through there. Cuba is a source of birds. Mexico is a big source. So a lot of the migrants that are here and aren't under trapping pressure here are under a lot of trapping pressure in their winter range.
What would be some examples of those?
Painted bunting. No, they don't come up this far. Ones that come up this far, warblers. So warblers are becoming, a few years ago we never saw warblers in trade. Now warblers are becoming in demand in Europe, not in Asia. All the raptors, but other songbirds, tanagers. So we don't have many tanagers here, we've just got western. And then a little bit further south, we've got a few more. All the tanagers are in big demand, and that's probably one of the, probably going to be one of our priorities when we really get into the looking at that. There's a few finches that don't come quite this far north, but are in the States that are getting hammered in their wintering range. But we haven't really had a chance to dig into it. So far, this is largely anecdotal. We see different dealers in Germany and the Netherlands and places like that suddenly advertises mountain bluebirds. So the bluebirds, all three bluebirds is another one. I don't think there'd be a lot of capture bluebirds for trade here. I think if any of you saw somebody out netting a bluebird by your bluebird house, you'd probably go and thump them. But in the wintering range, they're being caught for trade. And if you do see someone netting your bluebirds, you should go thump them. Next, please, Rick. So how can you help? I mean, the most important thing I tell everybody is this first one. Educate yourself, and then I always use the comparison with an airline staff. Put the mask on yourself first, and then help people around you. Same thing. Learn about the trade, and then educate people around you. We might not be really impacted here yet, but our species, we didn't see Steller's jays or blue jays or mountain bluebirds even a few years ago. So it's going to become a thing, a bigger deal for our species. Tell people who aren't bird watchers. This is the big challenge. People who aren't already interested in conservation issues. Those are the people we need to get on board. Share this information. If you're not on, share on social media. Social media is really helpful. I kind of hate it, but we use it all the time. We need it. If you're not on social media, get on social media. There's a lot you can do there. Learning about different initiatives going on, learning about issues, getting involved in things, even if it's just sharing information with other people and getting the message out. Help raise the profile of lesser known species. This is what we do. We look on all these things that nobody's ever heard of. And believe me, we need help getting that message out there. And support our work, or support the work of other NGOs or individual researchers that are looking at bird trade or other conservation things. It's always something you can do. If anybody ever wanted to go volunteer on a project at a rescue center or anything like that in Indonesia or Thailand or anything, please come and see me. There's all kinds of hands-on things you can do as well.
Where does your support come from primarily? I mean, are you largely relying on donations? I guess it's a big question. Maybe you're gonna deal with it later.
Yeah. So, in my previous life, when I worked on charismatic species like tigers and stuff, it came from organizations like WWF, from big government grants and that sort of thing that put a lot of money into tiger and elephant and sea turtle conservation. Now that we work on things that nobody's ever heard of, we get some funds from other organizations. Other conservation organizations give us funds for this work. We get some from foundations and trusts. We get some, we're doing some work on turtles right now funded by the US government, and some work on reptile trade in Japan by the Japanese government. But a lot of it's individuals, private donations, which is especially now. We were getting a lot of funds from different zoos. During COVID, a lot of the zoos were hit pretty hard and are no longer able to fund, or not yet able to fund conservation projects again. So right now we only have one zoo that supports us, that's the Singapore Zoo. We're also a little bit picky about which zoo we would take money from. There's two women in the UK that every year give us about $50,000 to work on bears. And they've done that for, I think, 10 years now. So people like that are our major source.
Does the United Nations fund this kind of stuff?
Yeah, there is, but it's usually for more charismatic species, habitat protection projects, and capacity building. So training enforcement agencies is popular with donors like that. We've done a little bit of work for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in the last 2 years. Wildlife trade is now considered a major crime. Up until a few years ago, it was not. It's now seen as a major crime. Interpol has a whole unit that focuses on wildlife trade. So there is more interest. Interest is growing. Funding isn't keeping up. But they do put in, there are different sources, government sources. But for songbirds, it's hard. We get bits and pieces and patch it together and do what we can. Yeah.
I was curious to know how you got started in this line of work in the first place.
Yeah. I always wanted to do conservation work. My plan was to be I wanted to be a conservation officer here in BC, was my original plan. But then I went backpacking in Thailand. I listened to a couple friends, and one was a ski coach and one was a hockey coach in Smithers. So no ambition in life. And I went backpacking with them, and I ended up at a zoo in Medan in North Sumatra. and it was horrific. And I stayed on there as a volunteer for a couple of years. While I was there, I started seeing wildlife traded everywhere, so I just started teaching myself and writing magazine articles and selling pictures to kind of keep myself fed. And then I just went from there. That's good. When I started off, there wasn't a lot of interest. Now I'm affiliated with a few different universities, and we get some PhD students on board with us and master's students, and we get to share the load with them and get more people invested in this kind of work. We've seen the number of non-government organizations working on wildlife trade really grow, and it's nice to have been part of that in a small way here and there. So it was a career I don't regret, but it's not an easy one.
I'm a little bit surprised that there's a market in Europe for this. I can understand perhaps the traditional markets in Singapore, et cetera, or Indonesia, et cetera, but there's no tradition for capturing birds, is there, in Europe? Or is there?
I mean, not really. Not really. There is for certain birds. Raptors in certain countries have been kept and continue to be kept. But songbirds, no, not really. It's so trends come and go based on all different weird things. Like I mentioned, the Harry Potter movie impact on the owl trade. There wasn't people keeping owls as pets in places to any degree like they are now before that movie came out. So it could be anything that triggers a trade. Disposable income is a big one. So people now in parts of the world that didn't used to have extra money to spend on an expensive lizard or bird now do. And it's fashionable, and people over there do it, why can't I? Investment, get a couple of these really rare birds. If you can get them to breed and sell the chicks off, you can make money. So there's that. In Europe, it's largely hobbyists who have a backyard aviary and are breeding rare birds and selling them within those circles of other hobbyists. Yeah, so any other questions? Now you're all thoroughly depressed?
Yeah.
Welcome to my world. No, but things are picking up. There's a lot more interest in what we're doing. There's a lot more interest in the issue. Like I said, Interpol has a unit that works on wildlife trade now. There's a lot more grassroots organizations in countries like Indonesia, and even living in Malaysia, we saw it go from a very small group of people working on wildlife trade to a much larger group just over a matter of years. We're now expanding our work into Africa and South America, and hopefully we see things grow there. We set up a few specialist groups so I helped set up the Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group, which is part of the IUCN under the UN, and we hope to eventually do that in South America as well, and start bringing in experts from all over South America and getting them all working together, putting their heads together and prioritizing activities and jointly tackling these issues. And there's a lot of good things happening. We just need more of them.
So you do have a positive feeling at the end of it, a little bit.
You have to be an optimist if you're doing this line of work. Otherwise you'd be sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth. So, yeah, I do. There's some species that we're really close to losing. Personally, I don't believe there's an excuse to lose any more species due to wildlife trade. But we are losing them. So we need to figure out why are we still losing them and what needs to be done about it. But there's no reason that we can't save these threatened species. The list is long. Our priority species list for Southeast Asia is at about 60 species that we have to act now. A number of those are already extinct in the wild, but still live in captivity. There's a few that are down to less than 10 birds. But there's still 10 birds. So, who
Can we
knows?
take species that have been in captivity and reintroduce them into the wild? Is that good?
Yes, so that's the plan with a number of species. Build up these captive populations. So part of it, the challenge is learning how to care for these birds in captivity, because many of them have never been bred in captivity. Learning how to breed them, care for them, rear them. Part of the specialist group that we're in, there's a number of zoos. The Singapore Zoo has a new facility that's got, I can't remember, 50 or something enclosures that are off limits to the public just for breeding these birds that are almost gone, building up healthy populations, and in parallel to that, working to secure sites where they can be released so that there's no poaching and that the habitat is safe, and then the idea is put them back. And there's plenty of examples of where this worked, not so much with songbirds yet, but with some larger ungulates, scimitar horned oryx, for example, it was gone from the wild. They've put it back and now they're doing well. Arabian oryx, California condor is a good example of that. Went down to a handful of birds, took them all into captivity, bred them, and then have released them, and now we've got well over 100 or a couple hundred in the wild. So this is what the plan is with a lot of these songbirds as well. Get the remaining birds, build up a captive population, and start slowly reintroducing them into places that are safe.
So they learn how to migrate when they're bred in captivity?
So,
They learn how to migrate?
so most of the birds that we work on aren't migratory in Southeast Asia. They're not migratory birds, but that has been done. Whooping cranes is a good example of taking a captive born or captive hatch birds and getting them to migrate again. But that's a good question. There's challenges like that. Are they going to know how to migrate? Are they going to know? Some species in Asia migrate according to where certain kinds of trees are fruiting. Will the captive birds know how to do that? There's all kinds of these problems. Elephants is a good example. A lot of elephants that have been reintroduced don't have a clue what to do because they follow migratory routes that for generations that are passed down from their mothers, and so there could be things like that with songbirds. We just don't know for the most part.